Moving forward, dealing with the resignation of an employee. This is fairly straightforward. As mentioned earlier, an employee is entitled to terminate his employment by tendering his resignation. The resignation, of course, has to be in accordance with the notice requirements stated in the employment contract. So, for example, if the employment contract states that an employee who wishes to resign must serve 2 months' notice, then it is imperative that the employer gives 2 months' notice. This notice requirement may, however, be waived with the consent of the employer. And usually, in certain situations, the notice requirement is waived by making payment in lieu of notice. And it could work either way. So, for example, an employee who has resigned and has to serve 2 months' notice, but the employer, knowing that this employee is already going to resign, is already going to leave the employment, and the employer now wishes to engage somebody else as quickly as possible to take over this position, the employer can then waive the notice requirement by paying the employee 2 months' salary in lieu of notice. Likewise, an employee who wishes to leave an employment on an urgent basis as opposed to serving the 2 months or 3 months notice period may make payment in lieu of notice, provided this is accepted by the employer. Please, however, remember that an employee who is forced to tender his resignation due to acts of oppression or victimization by the employer may then consider himself or herself to have been constructively dismissed and may then bring a claim for constructive dismissal against the employer. So, for example, employer has treated this employee very badly. The employer has not terminated the employer, but has treated this employee very badly and has just failed to reward the employee for good performance, or just made life very difficult for this employee at work. This employee may then tender his or her resignation and seek or bring an action for constructive dismissal on the basis that he or she has been forced to resign due to the oppressive act of the employer. Like I explained earlier, an employment contract can also be brought to an end through the mutual consent of the employer and employee. This is the most trouble-free form of termination because it's done through the mutual consent of both parties. And usually when a contract is terminated through the mutual consent of both parties, there would be an agreement in place, a mutual termination agreement or a mutual separation scheme to record the fact that the termination has been, the contract of employment has been brought to an end on mutual grounds. So then the employee cannot bring a claim for unfair dismissal or wrongful termination against the employer, and the employer likewise cannot have any claims for breach of contract, etc. against the employee. And of course, another situation is through the expiry of the employment contract. This applies in fixed term contracts where there's a fixed term or fixed duration of employment. So the employment contract will come to an end at the expiry of that duration. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, a contract of employment can also be terminated or brought to an end through the operation of the law. One example is frustration. So this is where a contract of, or rather, due to unforeseen circumstances or unavoidable circumstances, the performance of the employment contract is no longer possible. So the contract can then be brought to an end. And when does this happen? This could happen, for example, due to the death of an employee. So, for example, an employee passes away. So naturally, the contract of employment will come to an end. Or say, for example, the employee suffers permanent injury. Say the employee meets with an accident and suffers permanent disabilities, permanent injuries, rendering him or her unable to continue his employment with the organization. Then the employment contract may be brought to an end. Or, for example, where the employee suffers a prolonged illness, terminal illness, etc. And of course, in a situation where an employee has been convicted under the law, he or she has been imprisoned, for example, then naturally the employment contract would also come to an end. And there are other circumstances like change in the law, there's a war, etc. In a situation where we are dealing with expatriates foreign employees. Say, for example, for some reason, the work permit or the visa of the employee cannot be renewed, and the employee has to return back to his or her country of origin, then of course the employment contract will also come to an end under such circumstances.